welcome to another episode of Spill the Facts, produced by the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana's Youth Committee. I'm Stephon Gabriel, member of the Youth Committee, and I'll be your host today. The Youth Committee has an amazing topic for you all, which is the origins of race in Guyana. Not only does this topic prove to be essential at this time, but it is important that you, the viewers, benefit from first-hand information from persons who are versed on the topic, which will allow us to foster a greater understanding. Before we begin, I'll introduce the speakers to you guys. We have three amazing speakers. We have Dr. David Hinds, Dr. Alissa Trotz, and Dr. Mellissa Ifill. I'll give a short bio of each person, and that will be shared to our screens. Beginning with Dr. Alissa Trotz. Dr. Alissa Trotz is a professor of Caribbean Studies and the Director of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto. She is also affiliate faculty at the Dame Natabaro Institute of Gender Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados, and was appointed by the Vice Chancellor as the gender expert for all campuses of the University of the West Indies. Dr. Trotz is a member of Red Thread Guyana and the editor of the anthology, The Point is to Change the World, Selected Writings by Andaye, published with Pluto Press Black Critique Series. For the first 12 years, Dr. Trotz has been editor of In the Diaspora, a weekly newspaper column in the Guyanese daily Stabroek News. Dr. David Hinds. David Hinds is an associate professor of African and African American Studies with a concentration on Caribbean and African Diaspora Studies in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. His research interests include governance and politics in the Caribbean, race, ethnicity, and politics in the African diaspora on popular music and sports as political discourse. The Black political leadership, Dr. David Hinds, has over 45 years of political activism in Guyana. Born in Buxton, he came under the influence of UC Guyana. Dr. Hinds is an executive member of the Working People's Alliance, or the WPA, and is very well known for his political column, Hindsight, and other contributions to print and online media. Finally, Dr. Mellissa Ifill. Mellissa Ifill has been a lecturer in the Department of History at the University of Guyana for the past 20 years. She has a Bachelor of Arts in History and a graduate diploma in International Relations from the University of Guyana, a Master's of Philosophy in International Relations from the University of the West Indies, and a Doctorate of Philosophy in International Relations and Politics from Sussex University. Dr. Ifill's research specialties include democratic governance, ethnic contestation, crime and citizen security, and Guyanese and Caribbean politics and international relations. Before we begin, each speaker will be making 10-minute presentations, which will be followed by a question and answer segment. The audience should note that if any question may arise, you can utilize the question and answer and the chat features that are present at the bottom of your screens. Without further ado, I give the floor to Dr. Alissa Trotz.
We did decide we starting with the historian, Dr. Mellissa Ifill, because she in Guyana and David and I are not. So she going first, David's second, and I'm last. And I just want to rephrase, there's a maximum of 10 minutes because I probably will do a much shorter introduction so that we can actually get to the discussion and the Q&A. So Mellissa.
Okay. Dr. Mellissa Ifill, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephon. Good evening to you as moderator. Good evening to my fellow distinguished colleagues, Alissa and David, and to all the participants in this discussion. I am pleased to be a part of these ongoing conversations of great importance to Guyana that are organized and managed by some of our brilliant young people from IDPADA-G, LC, Stephon, and the others. I salute the work that you're doing to break the silence around difficult topics, including, of course, the one under discussion today, race. I must confess before I actually start that I hardly use the term race. I prefer the term ethnicity. I think the concept of race has been infused by notions of biological superiority and inferiority, and it has also been linked to the discredited social Darwinist theories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so I prefer to use the concept of ethnicity because I think it gives us scope for an appreciation of ancestral, geographic, cultural, religious similarities and differences among groups of people. I do understand, though, that the global audience is familiar with the concept of or the term race, and I acknowledge that it's often used interchangeably with ethnicity. For me, this question of ethnicity is one that has captivated me since I was an undergraduate student, experiencing my very first election in which I could vote in 1992, a long time ago. As a 19-year-old, I worked at the Carter Center for those 92 elections and had enormous responsibility because among other duties, I coordinated and managed a team, the largest team actually of the Carter Center at that time that observed the elections in Region 6. And it was this experience in 1992 that entirely shaped my academic career because thereafter, every single major paper or thesis that I did at the undergrad level, at the postgrad level, for my master's, for my PhD, focused to some degree on some form in which ethnic contestation manifested itself in Guyana. There is a tendency I noticed among most of us to focus on the role of political parties and individuals in the immediate pre and post-independence era in terms of shaping and determining this current ethnic conundrum that we find ourselves in. Most commentators have essentially indicted the PNC and the PPP, inferring that, look, if these two parties were not there, or if they were displaced, ethnic relations, particularly among the two major groups, these would improve. The sense that there is a need for a kind of non-ethnicized, for want of a better word, alternative to these two political juggernauts that we have, it has persisted. And in fact, over time, over our post-independence history, we see that it has led to the establishment of alternative political parties such as the WPA, and more recently, political parties such as ANOG and TCI, who are expressly claiming to not see or to not base their political activism on the concept of quote-unquote race. I believe that this kind of analysis, while it is useful in examining how and why our political parties too can benefit from ethnic mobilization, I don't think that they actually get to the root of our ongoing ethnic conundrum. And so I believe that it is imperative that we really kind of conduct an analysis of Guyanese history because it's key to understanding our ongoing ethnic contestation. And this is where I intend to focus for the few minutes that I have. I would like to point the participants for further reading to analyses emanating from Guyanese and Caribbean scholars that exploded just in the pre and post-independence era, talking about theories of ethnicity, theories of pluralism, cultural pluralism, plantation societies theories. These were very popular in explaining Guyanese and Caribbean socio-political realities. So we have theorists such as Lloyd Bess and Carrie Levitt and George Beckford and M.G. Smith and Nelson Cavallo, Carl Sohn. These are all, theorists who explore this question of why are we where we are at this particular time. Now, these theories, plantation society theories, plural society theories, Creole society theories, stratified society theories, they're all different. But if we look at them, we see that they all tend to identify a number of features of society that I believe form the basis for the contestation and the conflict that continue to manifest itself with us until today. First, that our society was dominated by the plantation as both a social system and an economic system. Second, these theorists tend to agree that the plantation economy was rooted in international capitalism and manifested in this part of the world by its dependence, on one principal crop. The third feature that they tend to agree on was that there existed several social race categories. And these race categories, these social categories were actually created by the resettling of groups within a common production structure. However, each group was restricted to particular tasks and to particular geographic locations. And it led to residential segregation, occupational segregation, or what we might call an ethnicized division of labor. They also agree that there is a general lack of social spirit, and it is in part linked to the occupational and the social segregation, and that race has become integral to the production process, and in fact is integral as well to the establishment of a particular type of class-based society. What these theorists also tend to agree on was that this occupational, that the society that this produced has therefore always exhibited tensions, social tensions, political tensions, ethnic tensions, always characterized by some kind of internal crisis. And oftentimes we see race or ethnicity at the core of these tensions and crises that would have emerged in the context of Guyana. They also argue that since the society has been characterized by a kind of recurrent conflict and discord, as a consequence, social stability is always at risk, meaning that it's like if we're almost always on an edge. And then they point to another feature that I personally think is critical to this whole discussion of the emergence of race/ethnicity. And that is there exists a foreign minority that maintained its hegemony and maintained order, of course, order as determined by this foreign minority, utilizing a range of strategies. So we have coercion, we have divide and rule, we have co-option. And so in the couple minutes that I have remaining, I want to touch a little bit on part of the latter. That is the use of divide and rule tactics by hegemonic European powers. I want to direct your readers again, your listeners again, to our listeners, to Guyanese historian Robert Moore, who discussed at length in his book, East Indian and Negroes in British Guyana, 1838 to 1880. He looked at the divide and rule tactics that were employed by these hegemonic European powers. And he argued that throughout the colonial era, the real and perceived differences and the constructed differences as well between groups were deliberately created, they were manipulated, they were exploited. And we see the generation of racial stereotypes and of course the emergence of antagonisms between and among groups, and that this persists until today. So for instance, examples of these would include the European colonizers utilizing indigenous Indians to police Africans, to protect, and of course to recapture those who had run away, the enslaved Africans, thus creating enmity and conflict between two groups that of course were not necessarily engaged in conflict prior to that. The use of indentured Indians to police Africans and protect, for instance, Portuguese businesses during the 1856 Angel Gabriel riots. And this moved the adversarial nature of the relationship between Afros and Indians away from the economic and the labor realms into direct physical conflict. And of course, they also used the Africans and the Chinese and the Portuguese to police East Indians, immigrants, when the East Indian immigrants on the plantation, they would have engaged in some form of protest and or riot. So keeping the groups separated and adversarial to satisfy the agenda of the hegemonic powers actually continued into the 20th century, in the pre-independence period, in the post-independence period. We know about the suspension of the Constitution in 1953, when the government was removed from power, and there was a resultant split in the multi-ethnic unity in 1955. both Forbes Burnham and Cheddi Jagan, in fact, pointed to the role of Britain in undermining the class-based multi-ethnic unity that existed. In our pre-independence era, for instance, there were a number of proposals for multi-ethnic unity in light of the chaos that was enveloping the society, the ethnic chaos and crisis that was enveloping the society. And the interventionist nature of the American and British alliance with regard to Guyana persisted. And so this is clear if we look at a series of correspondences between the British Prime Minister at the time, Macmillan, and the US President Kennedy regarding British Guyana. And one of them I find quite interesting, and I'm going to quote it. Macmillan remarked to Kennedy, and I quote, "I think that the only thing which would cause our plan to go seriously awry would be if Jagan and Burnham were in the next few weeks to reach some sort of agreement. I assume, however, that your people will be doing what they can to discourage any joint moves," close quote. So fundamentally, you know, my time is up, but what I want to suggest is that any reading of our destructive ethno-based race/race relations must frontally examine the interventionist role historically and contemporarily of hegemonic powers and of global capitalism. Fundamentally, what I want to say is that the politicization of race has always served the purpose beyond what is obvious and beyond what is evident. So I'll now leave you in the hands of my most capable colleagues.
Thank you, Dr. Ifill, for your presentation. Understanding better on the politicization of race and the issues with social stability and the divide and rule tactics that were used in those times makes me to see how those are now enforced today. Before continuing, I'd like to welcome Dr. David Hinds to give his presentation.
Thank you, Stephon, and thanks to my co-panelists. And thank you, young people, for doing this. It is very difficult at this moment to have a polite conversation about anything that has to do with politics and race. And so in a sense, this is a safe space because I would like to think that given the composition of the panel here, that we can have a discussion on this topic without degenerating into what our country seems to have degenerated into these past few months. I'm going to, as is the case with these panels and these topics, I'll probably repeat some things that Dr. Ifill mentioned in our presentation. And so I apologize to the audience for that. Now, the origins of race. The origins of race lies in slavery. That's the first thing we need to acknowledge. Wherever slavery occurred, race was there because race came out of slavery. The fundamental question that was asked is, why were these people of a particular skin color enslaved? And the answer was because they were inferior. And the whole notion of slavery arose out of that fundamental question that slavery asked. And so slavery, therefore, is really skin color with meaning. It gave skin color meaning. So if you are of this dark skin color, it means that you are inferior. You're biologically inferior. You're culturally inferior. You are less than human beings. And that was the basis of slavery. And so wherever there was slavery, the ideology of race, which we now know popularly as racism, occurred. That these people who are enslaved are inferior, they're non-human beings, and these people who are enslaving them are full human beings. And so the black-white dichotomy really came into play. It meant, therefore, that other ethnic groups, because what slavery did is to move what we call white ethnics, Europeans, whether they're Irish or British or Dutch, it moved them from an ethnic group to a racial group. And the Africans who had come from different ethnic groups, what we popularly call tribes, they are now moved from an ethnicity to a racial group. So slavery produced these racial groups governed by the ideology of racism. And out of that came what is called the color code. It meant that other ethnic groups coming in had to fit in. So we developed the red men, the yellow men, the brown people, meaning Asians and so forth. And that became known as the color code. But what this institution of slavery did was to introduce this ideology that went to the very core of the humanity of the different ethnic groups. And once race was introduced, everything in the world changed. Economics changed, religion changed, politics changed, because the notion of the human being and what it means to be human. So African people could not be human. And so therefore, wherever Black people find themselves, wherever in the world, the notion of race is there, and it remains so up to date. It meant that, and I agree with Mellissa, that our problem, our differences in Guyana are ethnic differences, are different cultural groups occupying the same space. But because they're occupying this plantation space, and Mellissa went at length to explain the plantation is based on the notion of the humanity of white people and the inhumanity of Black people. It means, therefore, that in a place like Guyana, we're practicing our ethnicity within a racial framework. That's how the race and ethnicity becomes interchangeable, right? And so although these ethnic groups are not historical enemies, they never enslaved each other, but they're operating within the confines and the context of slavery and the aftermath of slavery. And so our ethnicity, as I mentioned before, is operating within a racial framework. And that is why scholars of ethnicity today are preferring to use the term ethno-racial, because the ethnicity cannot be understood outside of the racial framework. That wherever Black people are, and wherever white people are, right, racism, race and racism become, so that's the first origin, I would say. The second origin was touched on by Mellissa, and that is the circumstances in which the ethnic groups came to Guyana and operated when they came. Europeans came and they met the native Indians and they sought to enslave them. And that created a conflictual relationship between those ethnic groups. Africans came against their will, and that's unique. That's fundamental to this discourse, because none of the other ethnic groups came against their will. And I'm saying it's fundamental because to understand race, one has to understand the experience of African people here in Guyana and white people. But since we have a small, if non-existent white population, then it's the Black experience that gives us an understanding of the depth and the breadth of race. So that in a certain way, other ethnic groups could get around the notion of race, could dismiss the notion of race. And some Black middle class people dismiss it too. But the African cannot, because slavery and race is their narrative of suffering. And though they don't talk about it every day, when the Guyana critic said that Black people can't read, that comes out. You say, oh gosh, wait, these people who are operating as though race don't exist, they get crazy. They gone in front of the house and they dress up in their hair tie and they say, this have meaning. So it's the presence of African people, that experience of slavery, that keeps race alive in our society. So the time of coming, so Africans came against their will. Mellissa talked about the immediate relationship between Africans and Amerindians. We don't talk about it because we want to be respectful to Amerindians. They're not in our racial conflict, so we tend to silence that aspect. But it was conflictual, the relationship between Africans and Amerindians originally. And then Chinese and Portuguese and East Indian came as indentured servants. Mellissa also went over that. They came into an environment with a notion of Blackness, and they then become part of that notion of Blackness, and that they began to construct their own identity against the identity of Blackness. And of course, there is the response from African. And so, therefore, what we understand today as race begins in the plantation and continues as the different ethnic groups came and within the context of plantation and post-plantation society. And then finally, we come to the decolonization period. Incidentally, I don't want to paint the picture that it was all conflictual. Walter Rodney is a brilliant book on the history of the working people, 1881 to 2005, gives us a real understanding of how there were positive relations among the ethnic groups against white colonialism. And so therefore, even as they are operating within the context of conflict, the overbearing nature of colonialism meant that there were times in which they found common ground. But as we come to the end of formal colonialism, and we are decolonizing, and we are moving into what is now going to be a free Guyana, quote unquote, with the Europeans not having formal control, the fundamental question is raised among the ethnic group. Who will control political power? And that latest manifestation, in a sense, took race to another level, the kind of zero-sum level that we are seeing operating here at the moment. So our history, I think, provides us with an understanding of why race becomes salient in Guyana, why we practice our ethnicity within the context of race, why Africans construct their narratives against the backdrop of racism, historical racism, and why the other ethnic groups construct their narrative in many respects in an anti-Black way. And so we have these tensions and these conflicts, and we have this hypocrisy. We're trying to cobble together a nation of different ethnic groups within the against the backdrop of a history that we have never had time to sort out. If you look at a society, it has had time to work out its economic system. You know, they chop off people's head and all them story. They work out their political system, you know, they work out how the different ethnic group will become British and so on. When the Americans, you know, had to work out how to become white. A lot of people believe that whiteness was always, no. All those people we call white people today only become white in 1952, recently. You know, the meaning of whiteness in America changed over time. We in Guyana have not had a time to work that out, to move from our conflictual situation, our identity within the context of race and racial conflict. We have not had time to breathe and to reflect on our history and to use that in a way to arrive at a Guyanese ethnicity. Walter Rodney, both in his activism and his scholarship, attempted to do that. Of course, that project is incomplete. And so therefore we have had fits and starts. But at the end of the day, we are really a country of different nations which are still to work out. How is it to overcome the legacy of race and cobble together a country? Thanks. I'll stop there. I think I overwent my time. No.
That's fine, Dr. Hinds. Thank you so much for your presentation in the context of slavery and the experiences of a particular group, which therefore contributed to what we have today. That is very useful and very informative. We'll now pass the floor over to Dr. Alissa Trotz, who will give our final presentation before we head into the Q&A segment. Dr. Trotz, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think everyone can hear me. Well, Mellissa and David have certainly gone into a lot of depth there, and I haven't actually written anything. I haven't prepared anything because I kind of wanted to hear where they were coming from. And I think David sort of gave us a really important introduction in his intervention in terms of thinking about the relationship between slavery and Blackness, right? A system of unfreedom based on the transatlantic transportation of Africans, and I'm using that word advisedly because that would not even have been the descriptor at that time, who are transported across the Atlantic to become enslaved in the Americas, defined as property and not as human. And that I think is the fundamental sort of issue and fundamental sort of basis of anti-Blackness that David was sort of elaborating there. So I want to say that, and then I want to say that the point that Mellissa made, which I think is really important for the listeners, and I wanted to thank the young people, Elsie and Stephon, for really convening us and for everybody for joining us, and to say I hope these conversations continue. I think this kind of ongoing grounding is really important. Somebody had put a Q&A in there for Mellissa around the plantation, and I think that is a really important point about the plantation as sort of the point of departure for understanding the modern Caribbean over the last 500 years, right? Like this was a system of industrial production, of monocrop agriculture on an industrial scale that is fundamentally related to the industrialization of Europe. But that plantation system relies on subjugation, relies on division. And after the abolition of slavery and the importation of indentured laborers from Portugal, from China, but predominantly from India, relies precisely on mechanisms of divide and rule. And so it's important, I think, in what Mellissa was saying, to understand that capitalism and racism are part and parcel of the same kind of infrastructure of exploitation, right? That racism or that mechanism of divide and rule is absolutely central as part of the engine of what keeps capitalism going. But what I wanted to perhaps come at this in a different way, and I'm you know, we're already at 7:40. So what I wanted to just share with the readers was how I came to this. I mean, Mellissa and David have sort of talked at the level of political structures, have talked about historical antagonisms, have sort of walked us through, and I think we actually need to come back and do a class to walk people through all of these different approaches to the Caribbean, whether it's plural society theory, structural theory, class stratification theory. So M.G. Smith, all of those, that's something that I think we should do really carefully. But they have walked you through some of how that has played out at the level of political governance arrangements. I want to take a step back and come at it a different way. And do that by telling you how I came to my own work on these questions of race in the context of the Caribbean, specifically Guyana. So when I got the invitation to this conversation around the origins of race, I was thinking about it more as what are they sort of, origin is a word I don't like, right? It suggests you can go and pinpoint a particular thing. But how do we actually try to historicize and understand the kinds of divisions that we see in Guyanese society that have completely exploded today in the context of the contemporary political crisis, where we even have friends who thought that they were friends saying that they never knew that folks thought about Black folk or thought about Indian folk like that, and the racial kind of vitriol that it must have been simmering under the surface. It could not have been invented overnight, has just erupted, particularly into social media. I suppose my interest has come from constant, not refusal, but an abiding curiosity to find something else or something different. So that Mellissa and David, for example, speak about the historical tensions and the conflict, which is absolutely important. And at the same time, there's the work of folks like Walter Rodney, Sarah Abraham, Nicole Burrows, Shona Jackson, that are also trying to find those dimensions of our interconnected lives that cannot be sustained by these narratives of separation. I don't know how else to put it. These moments of entanglement that can't be sustained by these ideas of racial camps or racial separateness. So one narrative of African Amerindian relations, obviously, is the narrative of tension and conflict, and the way in which indigenous populations were often recruited by Europeans to return escaped Africans to the plantations. There are, however, other important stories. The story of rice in the Caribbean, for instance, contrary to popular belief in places like Guyana and Trinidad, is the story of the transplantation originally of African rice culture to the Americas. This has been documented by Judith Carney, who is an academic who works predominantly in the Gambia, but who has demonstrated that, and this is also the work of Wazir Muhammad in his doctoral thesis, that rice actually comes to the Caribbean with Africans. The story of how it becomes associated with Indians in Guyana is a post-indentureship story. Even though we like to tell it as if it is an Indian ancestral or natural skill, it is actually a post-indentureship story that has everything to do with the way in which land laws were relaxed. And it wasn't that the Europeans liked Indians better than Black people. It was that indentureship was coming to an end. They didn't have a system to replace after slavery ended, and the Black people started to move off of the plantations, began to establish villages. With the villages, they had a kind of semi-independent, or a bit of, that's too much of a stretch, but some kind of autonomous base, right? You had access to a bit of land, you had access to space off the plantation. You could therefore begin to try to organize for more livable working conditions on the plantation. You couldn't actually not work for wages, but you could begin to bargain, as Walter Rodney establishes in History of the Guyanese Working People, and establish yourself as an incipient sort of bargaining group, right? And in that context, the hostility that they faced on many levels, first of all, the changing of land laws to ensure that Africans could not actually buy lands, could not buy lands collectively in the ways in which villages like Buxton and Victoria were established, and then that the prices were raised way off, or that they couldn't actually settle on crown lands, so they had to stay very close or contiguous to the plantations. And then eventually you bring indentured workers in from India, particularly from Portugal and from China, to sort of break the back of an incipient sort of working class or a post-emancipation population that is beginning to act in ways that is demonstrating some autonomy vis-a-vis the plantation. with the ending of indentureship, there is no alternative system that can come in to replace workers that the system needs. And so what they have to do, because indentured laborers are coming in, and Mellissa is quite right, and David is quite right, indentureship is also sort of designed as a liberal response in the post-emancipation moment to suggest that with indentureship, people are somehow coming of their free will. Even though we could have another entire class here about what free will means when folks are fleeing India because of famine and other kinds of horrific conditions. So that indentureship is sort of held up as freedom as opposed to slavery, even though the conditions under which indentured folks are coming to the Caribbean are really difficult. And even though it's a civil contract, many, if you break that civil contract, the penalties are through criminal punishment, right? So it's a completely unequal system. But the point I'm making is that at the end of indentureship, you have to find a way to keep Indians who under their contracts have the right to go back to India, and a third of them do go back. You have to find a way to keep them in the colony. And the way that you do that is to relax some of the restrictive land laws that had impoverished the Black population decades before. And those land laws are relaxed so that Indians can get some access to land, can begin to carve out some kind of space, that you have to find a way to keep Indians in the colony and to try to equalize the sex ratio because it is hugely unequal. And so this what we end up with are different kinds of historical and economic circumstances that face Black people in the immediate post-emancipation period and face Indians in the immediate post-indentureship period. But it's all set up in a way that is designed around the continued viability of an economic system based on the exploitation of working people. So that's the point I want to make. But let me just spend 3 minutes, which is what I wanted to say to y'all. I got into this because what I wanted to do, so finding those moments, for example, in relation to the rice, we could find moments in relation to where rice and beans, which is a diet across Central and Latin America that Black and Indigenous folks have as their staple. So there we obviously see examples of Black Indigenous cooperation. We could think of it with the Garifuna and the Maroons as well, or the Saramacca in Suriname, those moments of exchange that take place off and away from the plantation. So my interest has always been to try to find those quiet moments of exchange, of intimacy, of solidarity, of connection that defy the kinds of racial logics and the divide and rule of a plantation system that tries to keep us apart. And I guess this is why I'm so distraught to see this racial polarization today that makes it seem as if those elements have never existed when in fact they have. And so very quickly, what got me to this was that in the 1990s, when I came back to Guyana to do my research for my doctoral work, I decided to do it in All Boys Town. And for folks who might not even be familiar, All Boys Town became incorporated into Georgetown, I think about 1913, but it was the front originally of a coffee and sugar plantation, which in the immediate post-emancipation period belonged to a planter by the name of James Allboy. And that land was sort of given over initially to the post-emancipation African population, but increasingly to indentured Indians. It was one of the few, if not only places in Georgetown that had both Africans and Indians living there. And so I decided to do my work in All Boys Town, interviewing hundreds of African and Indian working class women to get a sense of what their household survival strategies were like. And we could get into this in the Q&A. I'm happy to come back and talk about this some more. But one of the things that has particularly interested me since then had to do with the kinds of similarities and convergences that I found among their practices, despite the fact that Black and Indian women somehow saw themselves as completely different. And that led me to think about the ways in which the boundaries of racial and ethnic groups get reproduced, how those reproductions are often based upon the control of women, right? Because you have to control the woman. She's seen as the mother of the culture. She's also seen as literally the womb through which the baby comes. So if you are going to control racial and ethnic identity, it's the woman's sexuality that you actually have to police and control. The ways in which we had these ideas or stereotypes that Black women are loud, they're vulgar, they're promiscuous, they're lewd, they don't get married. Indian women are chaste, domestic, housewives, submissive, they don't work. And when I started to do this work, and I'll just end here, the first and obvious question that comes up is that, hold on, Black and Indian women came to the Caribbean to do the exact same thing, to cut sugar on the plantation. So this notion somehow that Indian women are housewives is, we have to investigate historically how that happened, because we know for a fact that they did not come as housewives, and the archives tell you that. The planters did not intend for them to come as housewives, they came to labor, just as African women were brought to labor. So then how did we end up by the beginning of the 20th century with a situation where Indian women are now seen as the housewives, submissive, faithful, quiet keepers of the culture, and Black women are seen as vulgar, they don't get married, they work, they're in the labor market. So that was where I began to sort of unpick this question. How do we actually historicize these stereotypes? How do we understand how destructive they are in contemporary society today? And what might it mean to look at the histories of folks who arrive in the Caribbean and the ways in which their attempts to carve spaces, create families, operate in communities, work alongside and not always in conflict with each other? How might we begin to sort of retell that story in some different kinds of ways that might yield a narrative that doesn't subscribe to a divide and rule logic in which we essentially see ourselves as fundamentally different? And then finally, how do we also do this in a way that foregrounds the experiences of Indigenous folks? And Shona Jackson is an amazing scholar from Guyana who has written a book which talks about how this emphasis on the coast and this emphasis, her argument is that this emphasis on the coast and this hierarchy of narratives about who came first and who built Guyana first. Somebody sent me a video today, I couldn't even watch it. And it was a discussion that was actually the introduction, or the person who was introducing it was someone from India, but who was also Hindu. And we could have a longer discussion about the relation between that and the fascist Hindu fundamentalism of the president, the current BJP in India at the moment. But it was a really awful discussion because first of all Indians aren't Hindu. And secondly, the discussion was around who came to the Caribbean and who built first and who built more. And one of the things that Shona points out is that this is a conversation that Indigenous people are always therefore relegated to being primitive, being atavistic, being non-civilized, living in the interior until the contemporary moment when we want the oil and we want the timber and we want the minerals and everything that their lands are on. But the ways in which this conversation that we continuously find ourselves in, this plantation conversation, makes absolutely no space for reckoning with the question of indigeneity in a country in which at least 10% of the population is Amerindian. Look, we spent almost the whole hour just on the opening question. It's 7 minutes to 7. So Stephon, I know what you're going to do now.
I think we'll accommodate, we'll make it do. Thank you, Dr. Trotz, for your presentation. Just to recap, Dr. David Hinds gave us a historical aspect where he linked the relationship of slavery and Blackness and the experience of Africans and its contributions to us today. Dr. Mellissa Ifill linked the political aspect and the plantation society, whereby we learned about the interventionists and how they played a role in fostering what it is here today. And we try to understand a bit of capitalism and racism and the link that was present between the two. Dr. Trotz gave us a presentation on class issues and class issues and racial polarization and so on that is present today, and the control and the somewhat of differentiation between our women that poses the narrative of race issues. She also dealt with the plantation conversation and its place that is in society today that causes us to not be able to move forward from what we are. Before going forward, I'd like to take a few questions. We have quite a few coming in. The first question comes from Ms. Shemaine Headley, and this one goes to Dr. Ifill. Dr. Ifill, would you characterize the current social and economic environment as a modern plantation society?
Yes. Hi, Shemaine. Shemaine used to be a student of mine, so hi, Shemaine. Good to hear from you. Yes, I would say to some degree, the type of society that we have exhibit multiple features of a traditional plantation society. So for instance, we still have the dominance of, a very few or small number of economic enterprises dominating our economy. We still have the presence of the ethnicized groups. We still see that there is a general lack of social spirit, particularly exacerbated during times of elections. We also see as well that there persists occupational segregation, and to some extent as well, despite some level of urbanization, we also have residential segregation where, you can go along the coast and you can see, an Afro village, an Indo village, an Indo village, an Afro village, peopled predominantly by one group. We therefore see a perpetuation of some of the systems and some of the structures that existed during the plantation society, I suppose in a sense, in a true and genuine way, when when sugar really was king. We also see as well, if we look at our household index and expenditure surveys, even though they're dated, and we look at our censuses as well, we see that groups tend to dominate specific economic sectors. So we still have the persistence to some degree of occupational segregation. We still see, and again, as I said, it's manifested, in a very open and glaring way. When we have elections, we still see that there's underlying social tensions. There's an underlying kind of crisis perpetuated. And so as Alissa asks, we're all surprised and everyone is shocked, and no one ever knew that this was the way people felt or people thought of each other, etc. And really, at what it points to is that there was some underlying social tension that we have never really, as David pointed to, that we've never really dealt with. And so, yes, as a modern kind of plantation society, we still remain with the discord, we still remain with social instability, we still remain a society that is essentially teetering on the edge. So I would suggest that, yes, there appears to be an enduring kind of logic of the plantation economy and the plantation structure, both socially and economically, that persists in our society today.
Can I just add one little thing to Melissa's excellent response there, Stephon? And that is simply that what I would suggest that folks do is to think about what Melissa's outlined there and think about what that means in the contemporary context with one of the largest discoveries of oil in recent times in Guyana. In other words, I think that what Melissa is pointing to is, a deformed social and economic and political kind of structure that is underpinned by an extractive set of economic practices where wealth is sort of siphoned off to in a sort of pyramidal sort of sense, a very sort of narrow, it funnels upwards in a very sort of narrow way, and that wealth is extracted and removed from the country or removed from the Caribbean. And I think that if we were to think of what is happening with regards to oil, I think we might well see, or we will well see the way in which plantation logics are actually mapping themselves on to the latest form of extractivism. We could also do this kind of analysis with respect to timber. We could do this analysis. I have a student who is finishing his PhD now in political science here at the University of Toronto, who is doing this with respect to the collapse of the banana industry and the rise of marijuana cultivation in the Eastern Caribbean, but looking at the ways in which a plantation sort of logic is creeping in to displace small farmers who are trying to sort of establish ganja cultivation practices that attempt to break the cycle of plantation economy logic. So I think the key thing here is to think about extraction, exportation, and the ways in which most of the benefits of that do not actually remain in the society, and the social and political sort of structures that are fundamentally based upon these deeply hierarchical and on equal relationships. And the only thing I would add, and I'm happy for us to come back and to have an entire discussion about gender in this, is that so many of the conversations around the plantation economy tend to focus on waged work or the waged economy, or what we call the commanding heights, so bauxite, sugar, rice, minerals, etc. So little of it actually focuses on what we feminists refer to as social reproduction, the unwaged work, the work that women often do, the informal sector. Those are the kinds of practices that I think we need to also enter into a conversation about if we are going to talk about who are actually the folks who stand to lose the most from these kinds of economic and political arrangements.
Thank you, Dr. Ifill and Dr. Trotz for that. I do agree. Also, I'd like to state on the contemporary aspect. Not only is it with oil and is it with timber, but it also is evident in the gold mining industry. It's also evident in the bauxite industry. Companies are coming into our land and they're claiming what is ours. Though they may make some small contribution to our country, it does not. The country does not benefit fully from what is being extracted. We're taking this much and giving this little to what we have here.
Stephon, if I may take a couple of seconds
Yes,
to address that. Thanks, Shemaine. And I may not be carrying tales out of school, Shemaine. Shemaine is my little cousin who I'm very, very proud of. The concept of institutional and structural racism is very much part of the global conversation. And some of us argue that there is institutional and structural racism in Guyana. And some people interpret that to mean that we were saying that, Indian people were practicing structural racism against Black people. And that's not what we were saying. Precisely what my two co-panelists are saying, that we live in a post-plantation society, a post-plantation economy that has all the markers of the plantation economy. The plantation economy itself was grounded in the notion of racial aspect to wealth, racial aspect to politics, and so forth. And so therefore, as Alissa pointed out, part of our struggle today has to do with the oil that is here and its relationship to the accumulation of wealth. That it for some, it offers an opportunity to break out of the plantation economy in which there is uneven development among the ethnic groups. And so therefore this contestation for access to the oil economy has everything to do with the plantation notion of the distribution of wealth. And the plantation economy is not going to go away once the capitalist economy is present, because the plantation and capitalism are linked. And in race studies, we're now moving towards the concept of racial capitalism to make a distinction between the capitalism that helps to extract wealth from places like Guyana and the rest of the Caribbean and Africa and so forth, from the capitalism that they practice among themselves in Europe. So I think it's a very, very important question.
Thank you, Dr. Hinds. We have another question coming from Ms. Pat Francis. This is a question to all panelists. We can answer in whatever order that you choose. Please speak a bit on the role of religion in race relations. Dr. you're unmuted. So maybe
you want to take a first shot at it?
Religion and race relations. I think if we look at the role of Christianity in shaping the sense and sensibility of the type of society that was envisioned post-emancipation, a society that in which Africans and African bodies needed to be controlled, they needed to be policed, they needed to be taught how to be taught how to live, taught how to manifest the kind of quote unquote industry that a particular type of society, a desirable type of society that was envisioned. I think that was critical to the entire project. In the context of Guyana, we don't see the role of Christianity featuring very heavily prior to the early 19th century. Unlike so many other territories, we don't see the Dutch, who of course held control over Guyana for an extended period until the early 1900s. We don't see them embracing religion and Christianity more specifically as a tool for control and for coercion as it relates to the Black population until coming to the post the slave trade, after the coming towards the ending of the slave trade, and then of course coming towards emancipation. And the project accelerated during a period of amelioration between 1823 to 1830, and then even more so in the post-emancipation era, where, as I said, there was a certain desirability as it related to the population, what type of Black person the plantation economy assumed best suited. You know, this notion that somehow Afros are going to revert back to this primitive, uncivilized kind of condition and state if they weren't controlled, if they weren't guided, if they weren't steered in a particular path. And so religion fundamentally represented an avenue through which the African population was controlled and was guided in particular ways to behave and conduct themselves in particular ways. I don't want to necessarily speak to anything beyond that particular context because I am not particularly conversant on, you know, the other religions that exist within the context of Guyana. But as I said, suffice to say, you know, Christianity, when it was introduced in a very specific and peculiar manner. It had a specific agenda. It was not benign. It was not necessarily geared to, you know, saving souls. It was geared to policing. And so we had the introduction of all kinds of structures: the prisons, the court system, the police, and the church, you know, as all mechanisms of control for these African populations, these African peoples, who they assumed in the absence of these would injure this project that they were continuing in the post-emancipation era.
I agree with Mellissa. Christianity, and I think our audience should know this, they didn't introduce the enslaved to Christianity for a very, very, very long time. And when they did, it was introduced as a form of social control. What that led to was a counter Christianity, what they call here in the United States, the church, and what we call in Guyana and the rest of the Caribbean, the indigenous Black church, the spiritualists, the comfort, the others in Haiti, Voodoo and Santeria, and the Shelter Baptists in other parts of the Caribbean. So we had a counter Christianity, a resistant Christianity, and often we have to say, frank, that religion played a destructive role in terms of controlling Black and brown people. But that very religion, like I said, a resistant religion, was born, and so in a sense, racism. The religious divide within Christianity, within the Black community itself, was played out within the context of racism, where the Black church was seen as inferior, pagan, Till to this day, we talk about Obia in derogatory terms and so on. That is an outcome of the struggle within Christianity, kind of resistance, Black Christianity, and the European Christianity. So I would say that that's an area that needs very, very close examination because of the complexity involved. There is a growing literature on the role that Hinduism, and I think, yes, Alissa talked about Hinduism, is not the role of Hinduism in influencing Indian, Guyanese, Black Guyanese social relations, that it can assist them within the Hindu community has played a negative role in terms of relations, in terms of an anti-Black notion of the world.
This is an area outside of my expertise. So I just want to say, I mean, in the context of the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in the United States, there has been really sort of we can see a sort of a global conversation happening all over the world, including in India, about anti-Blackness in relation to several sorts of, whether it's religious practices, whether it's in the context of colorism in different parts of the world. So this is certainly an important sort of conversation that has been taking place. I just wanted to say two things. Number one is, there is a particular sort of position, for example, in relation to race and religion in Guyana. And as I said, this is not my area of expertise, but I know enough to know that someone like Keen Gibson, I completely disagree with her premises because it's based on an utter generalization when it comes to Hinduism and an assumption that Hinduism is ipso facto a religion that sows division, particularly along lines of race. I think that's a very dangerous line of argumentation. I have said this publicly on several occasions. It is lazy generalization, which I absolutely reject. And I think it's important to recognize that there are elements and dimensions of religion that can be invoked in particular contexts and in particular conversations and in particular historical moments that we need to think about. So that if we were to think about the way in which, for instance, dimensions of a particular religion, so if it is Hinduism in a particular moment, in a particular historical circumstance in Guyana or Trinidad is being invoked in relation to a set of practices that are asserting inferiority or superiority, we need to actually investigate that. But to do that without some overgeneralization that is intellectually, I would say, lazy, and also would ignore the fact that for indentured folks who are coming, which is unlike enslaved folks who are transported, and as David and Mellissa have pointed out, Christianity was something that they ended up having to rework, that is completely imposed. And I have a colleague, Jackie Alexander, who differentiates between religion and spirituality, right? So the kinds of practices that David is talking about, whether it's Vodun or Kumfa or Santeria, that we might want to think about differentiating between organized religion and African spiritual practices, or think about the ways in which Christianity itself, as David points out, gets completely reworked and turned against the kinds of ways in which it seeks to impose that system of hierarchy. And the most obvious example of this is in a marvelous book on the Demerara slave rebellion of 1823 by Emilia Viotti da Costa, called Crowns of Glory, Tears of Blood, the Demerara slave rebellion, which looks at the ways in which Africans draw on dimensions of Christianity, but use it against a system of slavery. Different from what happens when indentured folks arrive in the Caribbean. And there, I think what's really interesting and important to map is how Hinduism and Islam become central parts of a cultural repertoire of reproducing or recreating in a foreign land an understanding of what it means to be Indian, and I think that's where David accurately talks about this ethno-racial dimension, that, you know, Black people come from what we now understand to be Africa, speaking a variety of tongues from a variety of places. Part of what the plantation system does to break you is that they season you by ensuring that someone who speaks Twi is put with someone who speaks Ga, so they ensure that the Black folks aren't put with each other. It's a way of organizing divide and rule even among that community, so that they can't actually speak in their own language to organize rebellion against the slave master in the same way. Indentured workers are coming from different parts of India, different religious backgrounds, different castes if they're Hindu, and they are reconstituting themselves as Indian on a new soil. And in that context, religion becomes an important cultural repertoire. And we see this play out in the Indian community in the mid 20th century around the whole registration of bamboo and Nikur marriages, because before then, the only marriages that were recognized were Christian marriages, right? Because that was a symbol of middle class respectability. And if you were Indian and you married under customary Hindu or Muslim rites, that wasn't actually recognized as a legitimate sort of marriage. And so we see a lot of those struggles over race and religious identity playing out again on the terrain of women's bodies, right? In relation to the registration of marriages and ultimately the control of Indian women's sexuality.
Thank you. We have another question which is also centered on religion. Dr. Trotz, briefly, I touched on parts of this also. This one is from Mr. Vincent Alexander, and it says, does religion in some regards, from an ethnic perspective, perpetuate division and some of the stereotyping and prejudices? Dr. Hinds, you can begin on that, or Dr.
Well,
Trotz?
yes, hi, Vincent.
I will leave. I said what I had to say, so I will leave at that. I could say I don't know. I don't do enough work on this to speak authoritatively. So I think what I said just now should stand.
Yes, yeah, religion does, especially the organized religion that is grounded in colonial society, that still perpetuate those divisions. And as I said in my early remarks, I mean, it perpetuates division within the ethnic groups, because they're Christian Indians, they're Muslim Indians, and they're Hindu Indians. And I tell you, when you listen to the conversation among them, when other ethnic groups are not listening, you'd be amazed at what happens there. And even within the African Guyanese community, there are divisions based on religion. You know, the Black Stallion talked about the Caribbean man, and he talked about all these different religions to add to the stupidness and so on. And different denominations among the Christian community themselves lead to divisions. And of course, there are class divisions within the African Guyanese community, which I know of, that are linked to religion. I mean, if you are Black and Catholic, I mean, you invariably belong to a certain class, or Anglican, the Church of England, which is different if you go to the Congregational Church or the Methodist Church, where you tend to have the working class Black. So yes, religion perpetuates divisions between and among the ethnic groups and within the ethnic groups.
Dr. Ifill?
No, I don't have any real response to that, because it's not something that I've studied, so I would prefer to not delve into it beyond what I said as well.
Moving on from looking at religion and its perpetuation of division, I'd like to put a question. I think Dr. Ifill may be suited to answering it. What role do you believe state institutions play in maintaining inequality in Guyanese society? And if so, how can we correct this?
What role
do state institutions play?
State institutions?
Yes.
I mean, I believe state institutions play an enormous role in perpetuating and maintaining inequality virtually in any society. I think if we look at the genesis of most of our institutions, if we see the context within which they would have emerged, in many instances, they emerged to as instruments of control, as instruments to guide, as instruments to extract, as instruments to, to punish. And so as a consequence, we develop a different type, we develop a particular type of society that is geared towards the protection of the socio-economic elite. And sometimes there's a coincidence between the socio-economic elite and the political elite. So certainly I believe that state institutions play a very important role in maintaining a sort of division within our society and maintaining a status quo. I tend to tell people that there's this notion that somehow things will change on a kind of evolutionary basis. And my reading of history suggests to me, things oftentimes do not evolve without any kind of revolutionary break. And there have been many institutions, and institutions have this way in which if there are efforts at undermining and if there are efforts at eradicating, those who control and dominate these institutions tend to reformat them and repackage them and come again, even though when they're coming again, it's simply a subtler form of the exploitation or the extraction or the control or the domination. So yeah, that's essentially what I would say.
Thank you, Dr. Ifill. We have another question coming from Chelsea. She's asking, and I think this would be more positive to Dr. Hinds since he mentioned Dr. Rodney and his work. Can you speak on the ways in which Walter Rodney momentarily dismantled the constructed ethno-racial divide between Afro and Indo-Guyanese working people?
Yeah, and I think that's very important. If you remember, Alissa talked about the struggle that some younger scholars are waging to reconcile the ethnic narratives with the narratives of what EUC Guyana call meeting and partying. And in this regard, I want to commend to viewers this little known piece that Guyana wrote that's called Diasporas in a Strange Land, Meeting, Partying, and Meeting Again. Right. CLR James has this interesting notion of the moment, meeting, and of course the person having the capacity to take advantage of the moment. And he speaks about Gary Sobers, the cricketer, Sparrow, the Calypsonian, in that regard. And I would like to invoke that to talk about how Rodney was able to do that. Rodney arrived in Guyana at a particular moment in our history. We were in the first decade of independence. And like all post-plantation society, post-colonial societies, we are grappling with what this independence could be and should be. And in grappling with that, I think most of the societies lost their way. And in losing their way, they compromise the empowerment of the working people, ordinary working people. So what you had within our first decade of independence were attempts at social reform that benefited the working people. But that was done within the context of an authoritarian attitude to power. And that created tensions within the society. I hear what working people enjoying benefits by the Burnham government in the first decade of independence. But as people who came out of enslavement and indenture, they also are anti-centralization of power. And so you have these two instincts. I think we're grappling with in what the Calypsonian Valentino from Trinidad called the roaring 70s. It's not just in Guyana, it's in Trinidad, it's in Jamaica, it's in St. Lucia. And Rodney comes to Guyana and is able to use the tool of popular education. He's able to use the fact that he was not part of the ethnic conflict of the 1960s. He's able to speak to that contradiction within the society. And it's a contradiction that is felt in all the ethnic groups, including the Amerindians, but the Amerindians are not on the coast. It's felt among East Indians, it's felt among Africans. And so Rodney is able to bring that together and to create what he would call a non-racial movement. It's amazing because when you consider that, they don't like to talk about that today. Rodney was the intellectual, he was the intellectual leader of the Black Power movement just a few years ago. So here is a Black nationalist coming into this environment and it's bringing these two ethnic groups together in motion, which is very important, in motion. And so for that moment, he creates this new opening for a conversation about this new society in which all these ethnic groups are going to have an equal stake. But as happens in society like ours, that motion and the nonsense that the movement died when Rodney died, it's nonsense. And it's total nonsense. The movement gained steam after Rodney died. But that movement of non-racialism is itself in conflict with the interethnic relations that are endemic in the society. And so therefore, this movement to democratize the society, this movement to democracy, which was where the movement is going. The movement becomes what we call in those days a pro-democracy movement. It moved from a multiracial movement to a pro-democracy movement. And democracy comes, quote unquote, democracy comes in 1992. And that democracy reverses the movement, the Rodney movement. And I'm saying that here because we hear a lot of talk today about democracy. That democracy in 1992 reverses the multi-ethnic experiment that Rodney was part of. And we are feeling the consequences of that reversal 28 years later.
If I can add, Stephon, I think for me the value that Rodney brings to this discussion, I think is that although Rodney would have used a kind of Marxian prism to analyze the plantation structure that we have in Guyana and of course the wider Caribbean, I think what was very important with him and also with CLR James is that they didn't kind of slavishly follow that classical Marxist tradition of viewing issues such as race and ethnicity as peripheral. But I think what Rodney did is that they looked at the inequities, they looked at that class-based analysis, but they also recognized that there were ethnicities and that there were racial groups, and that the presence of the racial groups and what it engendered into society was enough of a contradiction that it should be looked at and viewed and analyzed independently. So when he was looking at the history of the Guyanese working class, we see this coming through. So it's not dismissing. I think what the greatest value for me, and well, one of them that Rodney brought, was not dismissing this ethnic/racial issue or this racial question, not seeing class as eliminating altogether any concepts of ethnicity and race and viewing it as false, consciousness, as it were. I think, he attempted to marry the two. He attempted to place within this kind of Marxian leftist analysis, he attempted to address as well this question of ethnicity. And I think that was critical, and it was important because I think a number of times when we have people dismissing people's sense of group identity, if you dismiss it and you say that, it's false, it should not be entertained, it should not be addressed, it should not be viewed, it's not something that we should even consider when we're analyzing our societies, it essentially is not a useful position to take. And we do find that, let's say, for instance, even in the unity movement, as it relates to, the post 1950s, with the formation of the original PPP, there was clearly an attempt to essentially dismiss the whole concept of race and ethnicity and subsume it to that class-based kind of analysis. But we see certainly that it didn't work.
Thank you, Dr. Ifill. We'll
I just want to add very quickly, Stephon, I just want to add quickly, agreeing with everything David and Mellissa have said, but I wrote a column this week, and I think it's important because we often put Walter Rodney on a pedestal. It is important to understand, and this is something that I has written. I actually, in something that's unpublished, I have access to all of her writings, that he had said he would not actually return to Guyana until he could see a way out of the racial crisis. And in the book that is recently published of her work, there is one essay where she points out that, in fact, multiracial organizing had begun before Walter returned to Guyana. This is really important if we're going to sit down and have a serious conversation about these things, to get some of this nuanced sort of history on the table. And one of the examples that she gives, which is based on some of the archival material held by two elders who would become members of the Working People's Alliance, Yusuf Koyana and Moses Bagwan, was about the work that was being done in the 1970s by the Indian Political Revolutionary Associates and the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, that involved both a race commission. This goes to the question that Matthew Gall asked just now, but we can come to that. But there was a race commission which involved bottom house meetings with predominantly Black and African and Indian folks to talk about race among each other and across racial divides. But also there was a movement to sort of occupy sugar lands. There were also protests that were multiracial when Walter Rodney was denied the position at the University of Guyana. So even before he came back to Guyana, he was already becoming sort of a name on the street. But I just want to put that out there, that this work had in fact started before he came. And then we can also go further back, so that someone like Nicole Burrows, who did her PhD, she's a professor at the University of Texas, Austin right now, but did a wonderful PhD at CUNY, City University of New York, that looked at the 1935, when we had this sort of convulsion of labor uprisings across the Anglophone Caribbean. And in Guyana, she looks at the 1935 moment, and what she finds when she goes to the archives is this incredible, there is certainly tension and racial conflict, but there's also all of these examples of interracial, intergenerational, across gender, collaboration and solidarity standing up against capital in ways in which the Indian and African folk involved are not actually sacrificing their identities as Indian and African, so that for the African folks, they're also involved in opposing the Italian invasion of what would become Ethiopia, and Indian folks are also sort of involved on the ground in Guyana in Indian struggles for independence. So they're not necessarily sacrificing that. And the last little thing I want to say, and this is to David, that I do think that when the history of the WPA, the complete and real and unadulterated history of the WPA is written, that one of the things that we might want to actually really engage at a very fundamental level, and it's hinted at in Andaya's anthology, is whether in fact it was a mistake for IPRA, the Indian Political Revolutionary Associates, and ASCRIA, the African Society for Cultural Relations with Independent Africa, and this goes to Melissa's point, whether it was a mistake for those two groups to dissolve when the WPA was formed. In other words, whether in fact we had done enough work among ourselves, and Ravi Dev and I often disagree on a number of things, but this is one thing where I do think he makes a really important point, whether we had done enough work among ourselves, thinking autonomously as African and Indian. We're not just that, right? Some conversations, I don't want the men in the room with me. I will sit with Indian women to talk about gender. Or if you're thinking about sexuality, you might sit with folks who are queer or gender non-conforming, right? So it's not as if we come in some homogenous package. But the point that was made there was whether when those groups were dissolved, when the WPA was formed, whether in fact a moment had been lost to keep doing that on the ground work, to undo the absolutely the enduring damage of the 1906 to 19 to the post 1953 break suspension of the Constitution, then the 1957 forming of the PPP and the PNC, and then the disturbances that culminate in 1964 with proportional representation, and the violence that convulsed the coast in 1964, that is our biggest family secret. It's a skeleton in the closet that gets let out and is actually out and prowling right now in the conversations that we are seeing on social media and on Facebook, but we're not actually dealing with what happened, not even what happened, because there's no one truth to what happened. We're not actually dealing with the aftermath of what folks have been left with and how that has actually haunted every dimension of who we are as Guyanese. And we're seeing it play out right now.
Thank you, Dr. Trotz. In the interest of time, we'll take one more question, and that is a question that Dr. Trotz also highlighted. This is from Matthew Gaw. He is asking, he's saying, recently, there's been some discussions on this 1960 and 1964 occurrences. Can the panel provide a historical context of what really occurred? And Indo-Guyanese on social media recently articulated a strange view that the violence in Wisma in the 1960s is a justification for contemporary racism. So I'd love for some education on that, on what really happened during those years. So let's see how—
Can I ask Matthew, can Matthew actually explain what he means by the violence in Wisma is a justification for contemporary racism? That could go in so many directions. I just want to get that right, what you're saying there.
Okay, I think that will also take some time for us to get through.
Okay.
So if we can either head over to the other question, which is on Alexis. Just to note, in the interest of time, we are taking this final question. However, we are kindly going to ask the panelists—
I would like to say something about that question though, Stephon, very, very quickly. I do think that is a really important conversation that we need to have. Let me disclose that I've actually been working on this for at least 12 years. It is an impossible situation to write about. I've actually published one essay so far. Well, two. There is an essay in the book with Andai that the two of us co-wrote, which is based on interviews with African and Indian Guyanese who were old enough to have lived through 1964 and experienced the race violence, and it's in her anthology. I have actually been doing work just on Wismar because Wismar is one of the few communities where both Africans and Indians lost their lives. In several other parts of the coast, the violence would have involved Indians fleeing a community, so they fled Buxton to go to Annandale, or Blacks fleeing Enmore to settle in what would become Haslington. Folks, Haslington didn't actually exist before the 1964 race violence. Haslington came out of Black people who fled Enmore, who squatted in an area that would become known as Haslington. But my work has focused, so working with Red Spread, we interviewed people along the coast and some on the West Bank, but I worked in Linden to look at not just the Wisma disturbances, but the Son Chapman. And one of the things, all I want to say to you, Matthew, this is a much longer conversation, we don't have time, is that there are two narratives, right? And this goes to the other question that came after about forgiveness. We have to find a way to talk about what happened and to talk about the fact that we seem to live with these two narratives. So that if you are Indo-Guyanese, your focus is entirely on what is called the Wisma massacre. Words are used like genocide, massacre, what happened in Wisma on the 26th of May, which then became Guyanese independence. So it's sort of a double injury or wound for many, for Indo-Guyanese in general, but the focus is often on the 26th of May and only on what happened to Indians, and not on the fact that, in fact, when you tell the story, it was part of a sort of an unraveling of violence that in fact had been triggered by the discovery of the bodies of a couple from Buxton called the Seeleys. And many Buxtonians and African folks from the coast would find work in Linden, so that when the violence was happening on the coast, that word would get to Linden. So, you know, I'm trying to tell a story that attempts to bring all of these different connections together. And then if you're African Guyanese, you tell a story only about the Norman Yaqub Chapman's launch that blew up on July 6th. And if you're African Guyanese, you talk about Wismer as a retaliation for what happened to Black folks in Buxton, and that then Black folks were killed on Son Chapman. And if you're Indian Guyanese, you say that Son Chapman was not just one narrative is that it was an accident, but that it was actually Black folks bringing explosives to Linden, to which Black folks then say, but Linden was mining, so it's like we're bringing coals to Newcastle. All I'm trying to say to you is that my work is not so much trying to get to the truth of what happened, because I think that's impossible. And that's not what we're trying to find is we have to find a way in which we can listen to the pain and to the hurt and what people have been carrying all of these years, and find a way to listen to each other in order to sort of move past it. And we have never had a reckoning. There has only been one inquiry into 1964, and that inquiry was only into the Wismer disturbances. And the problem with that is that it makes it seem as if only Indo-Guyanese suffered because the only inquiry was the Wismer disturbances. And in fact, a UC Guyana had gone on a hunger strike, calling for a wider inquiry of all of the violence that had sort of convulsed the coast. But this is our biggest silence. We don't talk about it. Younger generations know nothing about this, and it is high time we do. And the last thing I'll say is that you have a new vice chancellor at the University of Guyana. You have a brilliant lecturer, Mellissa Ifill. When the University of Guyana was formed in the 1960s, one of the radical things they did was they had courses. One was called World Civilizations. It was open to the entire Guyanese public. So all University of Guyana students, I believe, were required to take that course, but these were also courses that were open to the public and became a space for conversations that we could have as Guyanese. And I think it's high time and beyond time for us to think about reinvigorating that and creating the kinds of spaces. Some of them will have to be smaller for these more difficult and painful conversations. But until we can do that, we are going to be left with precisely the kinds of separate narratives that you're talking about there, Matthew, that where people are invoking 1964 in different ways and living with a certain kind of pain that can't hear the pain of the other side, but that is also based on a certain kind of narrative that, you know, at times also flies in the face of the historical evidence.
I would just like to add to, I completely associate with Alissa's comments. A couple of things. The violence was for 4 years, from 1961 to 1964. So it's 1964 was the tail end of the violence. So you have almost 4 years of conflict beginning before the 1961 election. Second, and this is instructive for us today, that the moment for that violence, and I use the word moment intentionally, the moment for that violence was the question of who governs after independence. That was the central question. What happens after independence? Africans are saying, do we go to independence with the PPP in power? Indians are asking, do we go to independence with the PNC in power? And so that became the moment for that violence. And that's instructive today, because the question that is being posed today, either in the public space or quietly, what do we do with this new oil economy? Who governs, who controls? And that's ominous. That's ominous. And part of it, as Alissa is saying, and I hinted at it earlier, we in Guyana have never had time. You know, we came out of enslavement, and we never had time to work out what that means, what that has meant for us. No time to reflect. And we got independence in 1966, and we went straight into the project of one people, one nation, one destiny, without time to reflect. And I think it's coming back to haunt us. We have not honestly reflected on that defining moment. Now, the violence that erupted in the 1960s didn't start. The source of it, the origins of it was not in the 1960s. And it, you know, sadly, we did not have the time, or took the time, we did not take the time to reflect on it. And if you don't, when a society doesn't reflect on an important moment like that, it suffers for a very, very long time to come. And I think this 2020 moment is reckoning. Perhaps we have to begin to think whether this is our last chance.
And the oil brings us back full circle. Let me just say one very little thing. So, you know, I have been doing this work on Wisma and Linden and what appears to be the race violence between Africans and Indians, but it brings us back full circle to the point that Mellissa brilliantly began with, which is about the plantation economy and society. Because as I started to do this work and to unravel what is actually happening, and one of the things with the bauxite mining that you do in Linden is you have to dig down and dig down and dig down, and you throw away all of this overburden, right? And so I've sort of been thinking, what does it mean to actually dig down and dig down and dig down? And when you dig down and dig down and dig down, it's not even, it doesn't really even begin with bauxite. These were lands that indigenous peoples were on. And they grew all kinds of things. And when bauxite gets, quote unquote, discovered in the early 20th century, the Europeans come and they dispossess indigenous peoples. They actually trick some of them. This would be some of the folks are coming in from Region 1. They trick some of them out of those lands. Those are the lands that become the bauxite lands that then Black folks are brought in, not just from other parts of the coast, but you have what we end up derogatorily calling the Palawala people. So they come from St. Lucia, St. Vincent, etc. So in other words, the racial violence that happens in 1964 that makes Black people out of the Vincentians, the Grenadians, the Guyanese, people who used to like not see themselves as all Black, but the racial violence made Blacks and Indians out of each other, but was built upon the invisibility of indigenous peoples who had to be displaced for bauxite in the first place. And I think that comes full circle. In other words, to have this conversation today, where we're back at square one, to me, talking about oil in a context of, you know, thinking about that in relation to where indigenous folks are as part of this conversation, and thinking about those histories and the silences that this continued narrative kind of necessitates, that we really need to find a way to sit with each other and to think precisely about the kinds of things that David and Mellissa have raised here, about who actually benefits from these continued divisions that we see reproduced to such tragic effect today.
Yeah, I agree with both David and Alissa. And for me, part of the tragedy, in fact, I had this conversation today because a friend of mine, called and she inquired, she's seeing all of these narratives where, one side, just as Matthew would have indicated, where one side is essentially just producing and reproducing a particular narrative, a narrative that suits and fits a particular story of victimization and of course, and perpetration of any kind of violence. And what we find is that there is a tendency for the groups to highlight one story without recognizing, as Brother Yusi says, there's no guilty race. Ultimately, I think what we have to accept and we have to internalize and be willing to understand and embrace is that violence was perpetuated by both sides, that no side is innocent in this, that there was deliberate efforts at injuring each other precisely because of who the other was, as a way either of retribution or as a way of gaining or as a way of protection. What it seems to me is that we have enormous fears, we have enormous anxieties, as a group, and we also embrace, whether we want to admit it or acknowledge it or not, particularly when it comes to politics, we embrace a kind of group identity. And I'm not sure, frankly, whether this, in fact, not that I'm not sure, I don't believe it at all, that this concept we have of liberal democracy is one that facilitates. I think the political structure that exists exacerbates the crisis because it presumes that we identify on the basis of individuals rather than on the basis of groups. And it presumes that well-reasoned arguments and well-reasoned positions could actually resolve some of our fears and anxieties. And I think what has been proven over time is that these well-reasoned arguments don't. And that's why we have all of these third parties assuming that, yes, we'll be able to break through. And we all hope that they do, but at the end of the day, we have to realize that a lot of the fears that people have, those fears are driving behavior. And how do we even listen to those fears? How do we hear each other? I listen to, for instance, Indo-Guyanese, and they talk about, the years of the Burnham regime, and it's very real to them. They don't want to go back to that period, and it's real to them. And I listen to Afro-Guyanese who experienced, in particular, the Jagdeo and post-Jagdeo years, and they don't want to go back to there. It's very real for them. And so the question is, if we keep talking past each other, if I present my narrative, one half of the story, and you present your narrative, the other half of the story, and we never have some kind of reckoning, we never have some kind of conversation, it would be acknowledged that, yes, this group erred, and yes, you were a victim, and yes, we were also victims. I think at some point, we need to get there. I like the others. I'm fearful about this period in Guyanese history, this particular conjuncture of our history. To tell you the truth, it fills me with terror. I see the radicalization and increased radicalization. I listen to my students, some of whom are all of 19 and 20, and you'd believe that they were alive in the 1960s. And so the question is that we're reproducing the fears, and we're reproducing the hurt in newer generations. And as the generations come up, my daughter's 14, and the kids in her class are having the same conversations, even on WhatsApp and in their class settings, they're arguing and they're quarreling and they're reproducing these same, exclusive ethnic narratives. At what stage do we acknowledge each other's pains, fears, hurt, and victimization, and at the same time craft some kind of path forward? I mean, for me, this is a moment in which we have to seize, and we have to do that.
So we need a part two, because I do think that we really have to have that conversation. And in fact, when you speak to folks, as I said, we've done so many interviews up and down the coast and in Linden, that's not the only story you're hearing. everybody, even the folks who have the most, we might say it's the most racist narrative that I was a victim, etc. And then you say, well, how did you get out? And they literally say to you, and we've documented this, and it's in one of the essays in Andaya's anthology, Indian woman and an African woman, they both will say, because we have that from both of them, well, if she's Indian, she'll say the African lady next door took me in and hit me. Or the African woman will say, the Indian family came and sat outside my house to make sure no one burnt it down. So in other words, even in the moment of tension, and in Whole of a Morning Sky, the Guyanese novelist Grace Nichols talks about that, even in that moment of huge conflict, are these instances of interracial cooperation. And that's what we have to hear these stories, and in these stories, which we have to facilitate really carefully, we have to work with these stories to hear those other dimensions. The almost blind, close to 100-year-old Black woman I interviewed in Haslington, who said that when she was moved from Enmore, she built her house to face the sun the same way it did in Enmore, so that she could wake up every morning and see the sun. Or the Indian man who had left Buxton and was living in Annandale and said he'd never been back to Buxton. And I said, where's your house? And he said, it's over the fence. And it's literally, you could throw a stone and it's over the fence. Like, that's what people are walking with. And we've never talked about this. Never.
Thank you. And given that this is a lot of needed information and all of this is pertinent, I'd like to ask the panelists if they can commit to having a part 2 with us next week.
Oh Lord, y'all putting us on the spot now.
That would be great, because I know it's a lot of needed information, a lot of things, and I can tell out by the way Dr. Trotz is getting emotional just now that we have a lot more to learn. We have a lot more to go through if we are to truly understand what the origins are and how we can get past this. We can never get past what we do not understand. So it's better that we understand what it is and move forward. Can we have a commitment?
Yes.
Dr. Trotz.
Considering this was Dr.
Yeah. I know, I mean, it's really, it's hard. These are hard conversations. So I want to say yes tentatively, and then I think we have to have a discussion about how we sort of curate it. But I want to say yes tentatively, and with your permission, I will probably bring, because somebody asked a question. I was saying Andaya's book is not yet available in Guyana, unfortunately, because of the pandemic and the borders not being open. But what I might do is, bring up part of that to the conversation next week and read a bit about that. Unfortunately, the Red Thread sister who did most of the interviews with me, Joycelyn Bacchus, has died. But I'm going to speak to the Red Thread women and see if there might be somebody who would join me for this conversation, although Joycelyn is the person who did most of it with me. So having said we need to do this, yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So in closing, I'd like to thank Dr. Ifill.
Dr. Ifill hasn't committed yet.
Yes, I will commit. I will commit.
In closing, I'd like to thank Dr. Ifill, Dr. Trotz, and Dr. Hinds for your salient contributions on the topic of the origins of race issues in Guyana. I think we were able to better cover the political, the contemporary, and the historical origins, and I'm sure that we'll better understand in part 2. Just noting to thank the audience who have tuned in. We've had over 87 persons tune in, and I think that those numbers are added on to Facebook, where we had over 80 persons too. I'd like to thank you for tuning in to our Spill the Facts talk show series produced by the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana's Youth Committee. I'd like to invite you all to like our Facebook pages, the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana and IDPADA-G Youth Movement, and also follow us on Instagram at IDPADA-G. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you to the speakers and presenters. We learned a lot, and we look forward to having you again next week. Goodbye.
You young people rock. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.